Thank you everybody for coming tonight. A beautiful night here in the fall. Next week, my colleague at UW-Madison-Dade County Extension, Taylor Seal, will be here. And she just finished her master's in public health with a pretty amazing thesis project for her MPH. She's going to talk with us about positive youth development at the intersection of arts and public health. So that was an intersection I didn't know existed. I'm looking forward to her talk. On the 10th, my friend Paolo Desiati will be here. Paolo grew up in Florence, Italy. Why he ever left, I don't know, having been to Italy. But here he is in Wisconsin and loves ice fishing. November 10th happens to be International Cosmic Day. I have not figured out why it's not Cosmic Ray Day, but they just call it International Cosmic Day. And he'll be here to talk about his research on cosmic rays. On November 17th, John Rolfe, who's with the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the Department of Biochemistry, will be here to talk about lignins, intrigue and controversy surrounding the little-known major polymer. So if you took a botany class once upon a time long, long ago, you know all about cellulose in the cell wall, and a little bit about lignin, because at least 45 years ago when I took botany, not a whole lot was known about lignin. And I think we're going to learn a lot more about that on November 17th. On November 24th, it's one of the 2 or 3 Wednesdays out of the year that we do not have Wednesday night lab. We go dark. It's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. And then we'll be back on the 1st of December. All right. Well, welcome everybody for coming to Wednesday night lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension, Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday night lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sumadu Atapatu. She's with the law school here in town and on campus. And I'm now going to ask her the 5 questions. She's going to step over here so she can be on the camera. Great. Where were you born?
Okay. So, I was born in Sri Lanka.
In Sri Lanka. And where'd you go to high school?
In Sri Lanka.
And then where'd you go for your undergrad?
Sri Lanka. It gets better.
And what did you study for your undergrad?
Law. Law is taught at the undergraduate level.
Oh.
In many parts of the world.
You're an advanced civilization. That's great. And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees?
To Cambridge in England.
Cambridge, England.
The real Cambridge.
Nicely put. Way to go. Those people in Wisconsin and Massachusetts just bow down. And then what brought you to UW-Madison and how long ago did you arrive?
We came in 2002, so we have been here for almost, at least I have been here for almost 20 years.
That is fabulous.
So we came here because my husband came to do his PhD. And he is in California and I'm here.
I will say no more. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Tonight, you're going to talk with us about climate change, environmental justice, and human rights. Would you please join me in welcoming Sumadu Atapatu to Wednesday Night Lab.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me here, and thank you to everybody for coming here today. So I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm sure everybody's hearing more than you want to know about climate change these days, and particularly with climate conference about to start, and I'm actually flying there tomorrow. So Tom was lucky that I scheduled it for today and not next week. I would have had to cancel. So I want to talk about climate change and the impact on people and the disproportionate impact on certain communities and states. We know that climate change is a global problem. Everybody in the world will be affected, not just this present generation, but generations to come. But unfortunately, certain communities and certain countries will be affected more than others. And these communities and countries contributed little to creating the problem. So that's this mismatch between contribution and the impact, and also the ability to protect oneself is what I want to talk about today. So I'm not going to go through this, but this was a picture from a recent Time magazine showing what's happening to our planet. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know already about climate change, because there's a lot of talk about uncertainty. Some countries use uncertainty as an excuse to not to do things, not to take action, but scientists are very clear. And I want to talk a little bit about the IPCC report that came out very recently, the impact on people and human settlements, coastal communities in particular, and as I said, the consequences on marginalized communities and small island states and climate refugees. Sorry, I forgot to put my timer. And also the role of environmental justice and human rights. And I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. I want to talk about some positive aspects as well. So what do we know? We know that the earth is warming, and I'm not talking about, and I'm sure you guys are all scientists here, so I don't need to tell you. I'm not talking about the day-to-day fluctuation in temperature. This is a permanent increase in temperature. And it has, the temperatures have already warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the Industrial Revolution. And the evidence is clear. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, humans are largely responsible. Right? Again, this is something that we have been squabbling over, whether this is a man-made problem or not. So scientists are very clear. And the last 4 years have been the hottest 4 years on record, right? And I'm sure you guys saw that Western Canada saw 50-degree temperatures, 122 degrees Celsius, very recently. This has never happened before. So, as I said, climate change affects everybody, but some communities will be affected disproportionately. And we are already living through this. This is not something that will happen in the future. And also, millions will be forced to move as a result of climate change. And even here, some community here, when I say here in the United States, communities are already being relocated as a result of climate change. Some statistics, this is actually quite old. The report is quite old. And you can see that this report says by 2020, which was gone, agricultural yield would be reduced by 50%. Imagine the impact on people, right? Water, again, water stress will be felt by about 1.5 billion people. This was last year, right? Malnutrition will increase. This is a health problem, right? A disproportionate impact in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Middle East, and At the same time, the population is supposed to increase to 9 billion by 2050. So on the one hand, we have fewer resources and more people, right? The recipe for disaster, right? So just wanted to show the contribution by each sector. Just wanted to highlight the complexity. I'm not trying to say this is a small issue, we can solve it tomorrow. It's actually a very, very complex problem. And as you can see, everything we do, every sector of the economy is contributing to the problem. So as a result, it's a hard problem to solve. But we created this mess, right? So we should be able to do something about it. And this is how the global temperatures have increased. And the current temperatures are off the chart, actually. So this is what the 6th assessment report said very recently. We cannot avoid some of the devastating impacts because we have locked in a certain amount of climate change because of the emissions that are already there. We cannot avoid some of these impacts. But there is still a narrow window to keep the situation from getting worse, right? But we have to act now, right? We cannot drag our feet anymore. We have emitted so much greenhouse gases that warming will continue until the middle of the century, even if we drastically reduce our emissions today. Right? So many of the consequences we see today will get worse, right? And if we think that, we have seen so many severe weather events recently, it's only going to get worse, unfortunately. Other impacts, the report continued, will continue for longer, right? Due to melting of the ice sheets, the global sea level will continue to rise for the next 2,000 years. Just imagine that, 2,000 years. And the report also highlighted that these impacts are happening faster than we expected, faster than we predicted, right? So this means that we have to learn to live with these consequences, right? At least for this generation and next generation, we must adapt to these consequences, right? We must try and minimize the impact on people and also other species. I mean, animals are affected too, right? And there's a big impact on biodiversity. We must increase the resilience of communities and build better infrastructure to withstand these consequences, right? And we all know that the president is trying really hard to pass this bill, which has lots of provisions on improving infrastructure and climate change. We don't know what will happen. Hopefully, something good will come out of it because, as I said, the window of opportunity is getting narrower and narrower. And as I said, some communities will have to be relocated. And this was a recent headline saying, lights out, climate change could plunge America into darkness, because we are totally unprepared for climate change. And this came out a couple of days ago. The United Nations Environment Program does what is called the emissions gap report. I think this is the 12th report. And the report highlighted that there's a huge gap between what is promised by states in terms of emission reductions and what is needed. So as you know, under the Paris Agreement, states made promises to reduce emissions. Even if we combine all of them, aggregate all of them, we are nowhere near the target of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, right? And this report highlighted that if we continue, even with the new pledges that states are making, the temperature increase is likely to be about 2.7 degrees. And, and this is well above the Paris pledge to keep the temperature limit increase to 1.5. And if we want to keep the temperature warming below 1.5, we need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. And 2030 is not very far away, right? And even with a 2-degree increase, let alone 2.7, small island states, and I will talk more about them in a bit, it's going to be a death sentence for them. Many of them are going underwater. This is from Canada, when their temperatures went up to 50 degrees. So I don't need to spell out the impact on people. And, you know, we already see some of these consequences, but in many parts of the world, this is, they are living through this every single day. So there's water scarcity. I read recently that California has, people in California have been told to start using less water because they're going through a huge drought. Denver, again, has a huge water problem. So some people here seem to think that, you know, we are insulated from these problems, but unfortunately, it's not so, right? There's land degradation and desertification. Many parts of the world are becoming like deserts, which is affecting food production and food security. And there are lots of health impacts as well, including mental health impacts, but these issues have not been, at least the mental health aspects, have not been studied very much. And with increased temperatures, we are seeing an increase in vector-borne diseases and some tropical diseases that we haven't seen here in temperate countries, and extreme weather events, right? We are seeing an increase in both frequency and intensity, right? I already mentioned sea level rise, wildfires. We have seen that too, and mass displacement. And some scholars predict that the next wave of conflict will be over water, and it's, I think, already happening. And again, recently, the medical profession got together and said, inaction on climate change imperils millions of lives. Right? This is a public health issue. And this report said climate change is set to become a defining narrative of human health. It will dwarf the toll of the coronavirus. And today, before I came here, we had a lecture on COVID-19 and global health security. And he said 4.3 million have already died as a result of the coronavirus. And this is climate change, the death toll and the impact on people is going to be much, much more serious. So bushfires in Australia, again, this was very recent, right? I'm sure all of you remember this. And I don't know how many animals died in this. This was really, really severe. And again, I mean, the pictures like this are becoming, unfortunately, very, very common now. Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Hurricane Maria in 2017, and I've lost count of how many hurricanes we had this year alone. And all this means, I mean, just look at this, the impact on people, right? How many lives are lost? Imagine rebuilding after something like this. So the United Nations Environment Program said, environmentally reduced migration has the potential to become a phenomenon of unprecedented scale and scope, right? It affects the global economy, international development, etc. Right? And it's a huge security problem as well. Talking of security, the UN Security Council also held a debate on international peace and security and climate change. And at that, small island states said the impact of climate change on small islands is no less threatening than dangers of guns and bombs, right? Pacific Island countries are likely to face massive dislocations of people, similar to population flows sparked by conflict. Impact on identity and social cohesion are likely to cause as much resentment, hatred, and alienation as any refugee crisis, right? And in the Maldives, over 60% of habitable land is facing erosion, right? Tuvalu said at this debate, nationhood is at stake, moving from a cold war to a warming war, right? So if you lose your country, where are you going to go? If your country is no longer habitable, what will happen to you? I will skip this. So Mary Robinson, who was the former president of Ireland, and she was also the special representative of the UN Secretary General on climate change, said she believes that climate change is the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century. And for a long time, the climate change was considered as just an environmental problem, didn't really appreciate the impact on people or the enjoyment of rights. It wasn't considered really as a security issue or even a public health issue. And the impact on the economy is going to be huge. It's already huge, right? So although the impact of climate change on human beings is obvious, it was not considered as a human rights issue until about 10 years ago, right? And in 2009, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on climate change and human rights and requested the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on the link. And the report recognized that almost all human rights could be affected by climate change. From right to life, we know people have died and people will die as a result of climate change related consequences. I mentioned the health impact, so right to health would be affected, right to water, food, housing, right to privacy and family life. So all the human rights that we take for granted today could be affected as a result of climate change. And the irony is, of course, states have already signed on to these human rights treaties to protect rights of people. And whether or not that's mentioned in climate documents doesn't really matter, because states have to fulfill their obligations in relation to climate change as well. So when we talk about climate change and human rights, we need to sort of distinguish between several situations, because what we are experiencing today is due to historic emissions or the damage caused by historic emissions. And we know that it's the accumulation of greenhouse gases by every state in the international community that's causing climate change. So tracing damage to a particular country is not easy, right? So the under law, if you're saying that somebody violated your rights, you need to show the link between that person's action and the damage to you, right? When it comes to global issues like climate change, it's hard to do that, right? Attribution science has developed quite a bit, and we know at least the most culpable companies, but still it's legal sort of liability frameworks haven't evolved to such an extent to hold a range of actors for the damage caused by climate change. So historic responsibility is a little hard, but when it comes to mitigation and adaptation, states have obligations to protect people, right? So for example, if we are going for renewable energy, if you locate your wind farms on indigenous land, there is a clear violation of rights, right? And then I mentioned that we have locked in a certain amount of climate consequences, so we have to adapt to these consequences. So the adaptation plans that states put in place could also violate rights if you don't provide the necessary information to people, if you don't get their participation in the process, if you don't involve them in formulating these plans, if you don't incorporate traditional knowledge of indigenous people, then there could be a violation when it comes to adaptation measures as well. In addition, we know that these severe weather events are also increasing, and states also have obligations during or before, during, and after these severe weather events. So providing timely warnings, evacuations when necessary. And, you know, we are living through all this right now with all these severe weather events. States must provide shelter, emergency services, and helping to rebuild as well. So there are human rights obligations in all these different situations. And then some of the measures we put in place to help climate change, like, for example, going for bioenergy, could have an impact on rights. So some of the mitigation measures could lead to a violation of rights. Some of the programs that we have adopted, like the Clean Development Mechanism, where developed countries can get credit for investing in developing countries, have led to human rights violations. The RED program, where again, developing countries can get credit for preserving forests, has led to violation of indigenous rights. So adopting a rights-based approach, looking at these programs and actions through a human rights lens is important, because otherwise, by taking measures to address climate change, we could be actually violating rights of people. Similarly with adaptation measures. So the problem is, of course, those who contributed least to the problem are being affected most, right? So this raises justice issues. So as I said, at a minimum, adaptation plans must be made with the participation of those who are likely to be affected, providing them with necessary information. Usually, information is not provided to them in a timely manner or in an accessible manner, in a language that they can understand, and incorporating local knowledge in these plans is important, right? And they say that climate change adaptation is all about water. Either you have too much or too little, right? And this is what's happening already. So I mentioned vulnerable groups and states, and these are more affected than others because of climate change. So this could be due to historic marginalization or other vulnerabilities or even geography, right? Some groups and states are more susceptible to climate change than others. And these groups include women, children, indigenous people, the elderly, poor people, as we know, are much more affected or disproportionately affected, refugees, disabled people, minorities, LGBTQ people, the list goes on, right? So we also know that the environmental justice movement originated in the US because of this disproportionate impact on certain communities, and because of the practice of citing these polluting activities in minority and poor communities, right? There was a real injustice here. There were racial minorities, there were poor communities, and I'm not saying it's all done, it's still happening. And then vulnerable countries include small island states and low-lying countries like Bangladesh, and poor countries that lack resources and technology to engage in adaptation measures, right? Climate change was predominantly caused by industrialized countries in the process of industrialization. So it's an externality of industrialization, but countries who contributed very little are being affected disproportionately. Polar regions are warming twice as fast as other areas. And I mentioned climate refugees. So this is a picture from Bangladesh. I mentioned women because in many societies, women are responsible for fetching water and gathering firewood, and climate change will exacerbate water scarcity. And women and girls will have to walk longer distances to collect water. As a result, they have less time for education, leisure, and they are also more susceptible to violence. There's literature to show that there's more gender-based violence because they have to walk longer distances. They are more exposed to violence as well. So I want to talk a little bit about climate refugees. In the very first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1990, mind you, the report recognized that the greatest single impact of climate change could be on human migration. And did we do anything about it? No, right? We rarely do things when we recognize the problem, right? We drag our feet. The problem is, of course, the Geneva Convention on Refugees that we adopted after the Second World War applies only to political refugees. So you have to show political persecution based on certain factors, your race, ethnicity, national origin, things like that. So that definition does not cover climate refugees, right? Although climate displacement will be mainly internal, cross-border migration cannot be ruled out. And we see that some of the refugees who come here from Central America are actually fleeing drought and crop failures due to climate change. And for those who are on small island states, relocation en masse will be the only option, really. But currently, there's no legal protection if people cross an international border due to climate change. The Geneva Convention on Refugees will not be applicable. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement, for the first time, remember, 1990, the IPCC recognized this problem. In 2015, a task force on climate displacement was established to look into the issue. So it took us 25 years. So the problem is, of course, climate change will not be the only driver of migration. There are so many factors that are involved, and people rarely move for climate-related reasons only. And it's usually the last resort as well. So as a result, it's hard to find credible numbers of people who will be displaced as a result of climate change. But the predictions are that it will be somewhere between 20 million to 200 million by 2050. I mean, even if we get a very conservative figure, it will still be in the millions, right? And 2050 is not very far away. And I mean, we don't have to wait for 2050, it's already happening. And the other issue, of course, is conflicts over resources can trigger migration, and migration can trigger conflicts over resources in the new place, right? So migration is the result of conflict as well as the cause of conflict in some instances. And even if most migration will take place internally, or most displacement will take place internally, it gives rise to so much disruption and hardship for people, right? Some refer to migration as a form of adaptation, but there are people who cannot move even if they want to, right? For various reasons, either due to poverty or family reasons, ill health, disability. So we need to pay attention to these trapped populations as well, right? So at the same time, millions will be forced to move. At the same time, some won't be able to move even if they want to, right? So looking at migration as a form of adaptation will ignore these trapped populations. And this is here. This was a headline a few years ago. Will Alaska villagers be America's first climate change refugees? Right? Scientists estimate that village of Kivalina will be underwater by the year 2025. Right? This is 2021. And another community in Louisiana, right? This was from New York Times in 2016, resettling the first American climate refugees. This community, these are all indigenous communities as well, by the way. They received a federal grant to relocate this entire community, right? From this island to the mainland. I mean, imagine, just look at how they are living already, right? And this is the richest country in the world. See how these people are living. So sad. Another headline from 2016. Reeling from effects of climate change, Alaskan village votes to relocate, right? As far as I know, this community, Shishmarov in Alaska, has not been relocated. They have not found a place to relocate to. And because they are going to be relocated, nobody is improving their living standards, and some of them even don't have running water or plumbing, apparently. So, and the other question is, who is going to pay for the relocation? And another vulnerable group is Indigenous people. As we know, they have a very intimate relationship with the land, and the communities that I mentioned, I just showed, are all Indigenous people. The Inuit, so that was a very interesting case, actually. Some of the Inuit of Canada and US got together and filed a petition against the United States. This was in 2005, so many, many years ago, in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, saying that US was the biggest contributor in 2005. US was. China overtook the US in 2007. So at that time, US was the biggest contributor and was refusing to take action. Climate change is having a disproportionate impact on the Arctic. They submitted scientific evidence. It was a really nice petition. It was about 175 pages with pictures and everything. And the petitioners argued that these impacts were having, was leading to a violation of their rights under the American Declaration of Human Rights, which the US has signed on to. But the commission said there was insufficient evidence to hold the US accountable, but it did hold a hearing on the link between climate change and human rights. And I think this case actually spurred action in the Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution on climate change and human rights. And more recently, the good news that I said, that I promised I will give you, is that the Human Rights Council recognized for the first time a human right to a healthy environment under international law. This was the first time that it happened. It's recognized under regional human rights treaties, but it was the first time that the Human Rights Council recognized right to a healthy environment. So I think it's a huge development and would be helpful to victims of climate change. And the other good news was that it also created a mandate for a special rapporteur. These are special mandate positions, special procedures under the Human Rights Council to study the link between climate change and human rights. So to talk a little bit more about small island states and their people, that the risk of slowly sinking and eventually disappearing. And we are talking about 50 sovereign nations who could completely disappear in some time in the future, right? So the question is, what will happen to these people, right? Where will they go? Will they become stateless? Will they become refugees? What happens to their citizenship, right? If your country disappears completely, what happens to them? And there are lots of legal issues that arise because under international law, states haven't physically disappeared. And we have a situation where 50 sovereign nations could disappear altogether, not to mention the humanitarian issue. And this is where small island states are. There are some in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, as well as in the Indian Ocean, Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and then of course we have all these Marshall Islands, etc., in the Caribbean. This is a picture from Kiribati in the Pacific Ocean. So to talk a little bit about the justice framework, we have the human rights framework, which is useful to give effect to the justice framework, but there are components that are useful to look at when it comes to climate change because of this disproportionate impact on people and the disproportionate contribution to the problem, right? So distributive justice recognizes that there should be fair allocation of benefits and burdens, not just burdens on certain communities, but you need to distribute benefits as well, right? And we see this in relation to COVID as well, right? Procedural justice, and we know that the decision-making process should be fair and open and inclusive, right? Very often we don't get the input. We don't listen to the people whose rights are affected by the decisions we take today, right? So including them in the decision-making process, giving them sufficient information and being transparent about our decisions is very important. And then corrective justice, right? We have an obligation to provide compensation when their rights are violated, right? So in the situation of climate change, who has the obligation to provide corrective justice, right? Should we hold all industrialized countries accountable? Establish a fund to help these countries who are being disproportionately affected? So these are big questions that we need to address. And then social justice recognizes that these environmental struggles are part of larger struggles for economic justice and social justice. So we cannot really look at environmental justice in isolation from these other struggles, right? And these injustices interact with one another. So intersectionality is an important lens to look at some of these, and they also multiply, right? So we can apply this framework in relation to vulnerable communities as well as vulnerable states. So I'm almost out of time, I think, but we'll quickly look at the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. For the first time, an environmental treaty included a provision on human rights. And that's big too, right? As I said, although we have talked about this link, this was the first time an environmental treaty actually included a provision on human rights as well as right to health was mentioned. There was a reference made to climate justice too, although in a rather half-hearted way. It also recognized the integrity of all ecosystems, the importance of biodiversity, public awareness, public participation, importance of education, access to information. All these were included in the Paris Agreement. And there was a separate provision on adaptation measures. There has always been a tension between adaptation and mitigation. We know that we have to reduce emissions, but at the same time, we also know that the current generation needs and the next generation need to adapt to these consequences. So where should we put our limited resources to mitigation measures or adaptation measures? And adaptation has always been treated as being less important than mitigation. And the Paris Agreement recognized that some damages will be irreparable. We won't be able to do anything about them. So this loss and damage mechanism was included in the Paris Agreement as a way to compensate some of these communities and states. Although it was included, we still don't know how this is going to pan out. And developed countries, including the United States, did not want this included in the Paris Agreement. So they said when they signed on to this, they included this provision to say loss and damage mechanism does not give rise to liability and compensation. So I don't know how this will play out. So I mentioned the Human Rights Council resolution. There was a reference to climate change as well. So to conclude, as I said, climate change is a complex problem and often it can seem overwhelming, and everything we do contributes to it, right? Every country in the world, every sector of the economy is contributing, and we are fast approaching tipping points. And from this, there won't be no return is possible. There was a World Bank report which looked at, this was a few years ago, which looked at the emission reduction obligations that states made and said that we are approaching towards an increase in 4 degrees in temperature, not 2 degrees, right? As I mentioned, the IPCC report said we have to cut our CO2 emissions 50% by 2030, and we have to go carbon neutral by 2050. Right? So we don't have much time. And President Obama said we are the first generation to feel the consequences of climate change and the last generation to be able to do something about it, right? So we have a huge responsibility. And the younger generation is really mad that we are not doing anything, right? Because they are going to feel the brunt of our inaction, right? The Paris Agreement is only the beginning. And I think it's really unfortunate, like COVID, climate change has become a huge political issue, right? So we have to act now, treat this as an emergency. As I said, we created this problem, so we should try and solve it. We owe it to our children and grandchildren and declare climate emergency. In fact, Indigenous leaders requested President Biden recently to treat climate as an emergency. And I think I'll leave you with this. What if it's a big hoax and we created a better world for nothing? Thank you so much. Are you good? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll raise the same question that I always do at presentations of this type. It's a very comprehensive presentation that you've given, but for some reason it doesn't touch on the question of population control, which I believe is a significant key to the other aspects of climate change. And the subject is always dismissed because it's sexist or racist or whatever. But it's something that I feel very strongly is the elephant in the room that cannot be avoided. And then the other point I bring up is there needs to be some kind of fiscal reform. I mean, as you mentioned, people have very limited rights to travel across borders, but capital has almost unlimited freedom to travel wherever it wants. And my concern is that as long as people have the money to buy a 5,000 square foot home or a $50,000 car, they're going to do that. And those kind of expensive homes will continue to be built. So some kind of fiscal measures need to be taken so people don't have the ability to invest in such wasteful consumption habits? Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. But you have asked this question from me before, so I will give the same answer. But you touched on several important things, and you kind of answered your own question in your second question. Because I agree, I mean, population is a problem. And I mentioned that by 2050, we will have 9 billion people, which means that we need more resources. We need more water, we need more food, we need clothing, housing, everything, right? More energy. But it's not just about numbers, right? Because it's a consumption that's a problem. But one person in a developed country consumes 80% more resources than a person in a developing country. So it's not, population is not the only problem, right? We have to cut consumption. We don't need all these resources. The other is, of course, the inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor. I don't know whether you guys have seen this report. Oxfam came up with this report a few years ago. It said 20 odd, or let's say 25 billionaires. And this is 25 people, okay, in the world, control more wealth than 3.5 billion poor people put together. 25 people, individuals, control more wealth in this world than the poor half of the entire world put together. So how did that happen? Right? We have let the corporations do whatever they want. We don't tax them. There's hardly any regulation, right? So it's, I'm sorry to say, but the current economic system has given rise to this problem. So, but I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. What we are doing is tinkering at the margins, and that's not going to be enough, unfortunately. We have to cut down consumption. Obviously, population control. The problem with putting the blame on population control is we are putting the blame on developing countries because that's where most of the population growth is taking place. But we are not pointing the finger at the unprecedented levels of consumption that's taking place in developed countries. So that's where the real problem is. You had a question?
Yes, earlier in the presentation, there was a slide that showed there was a report on on what things would be like in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, how does that compare with, how does that report for 2020 compare with reality last?
I think it's worse. The situation is worse. I couldn't actually find current numbers. I tried to find, I couldn't. But what they're saying is those predictions were way off. We are actually worse off than we were earlier, which is pretty unfortunate, right?
I've got Raj from Zoom asks, does the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change address the cost involved? Could be $2 quadrillion to meet human rights concerns, as well as the cost involved for preserving food and culture of countries, preservation of animal population, protecting biodiversity all across the globe. And which country should bear the cost of environmental justice? Raj keeps asking these easy questions. There you go, Raj. Appreciate it.
So I'm not an economist, but economies are working on this issue, obviously. But I will say this, we keep on saying we don't have money to address climate change, but we have enough money to spend on arms and ammunition. We spend trillions of dollars on armies and weapons and on national security. Right? If we use a fraction of that money, we'll be able to address climate change. We don't need all of that. So treat climate change as a security issue. That's what I say. I mean, we'll do anything to protect ourselves from, invading armies. If something is a national security issue, we will do anything. Money is not a problem. So let's use some of that money to address climate change, because believe me, climate change is going to be a security issue. It's going to be much worse than a security issue. It's not only a security issue.
So to your point, this morning on NPR, there was a story about how the Defense Department again reiterated climate change is the pressing problem that they're facing. And it already is, from the Defense Department's point of view, a national security issue. Yet we can't get pivotal people to control money and policies to respond to that. So it's weird that it isn't the Department of Defense that's the laggard.
Actually, Pentagon actually has a report on climate change and security. So they are taking this very seriously. But we need much more investment, much more serious investment on climate change. Not just here, in developing countries too, because, if there's unrest there, it's going to affect us at some point.
Some past legal issues, but hopeful about the law can be more productive in the future.
Could the law be more productive?
I hope so. Unfortunately, law tends to lag behind, and international law is a very different system of law, because we rely on states to fulfill their obligation. There's no international police to hold states accountable. And particularly when it comes to powerful states like the United States, the rest of the world cannot really do much. So it's a very imperfect system we have at the international level. But we have, there are success stories. The ozone regime is one of the most successful legal regimes we have in place. And there, US was a leader. I think US needs to take back its leadership in climate negotiations, and we need to get industry on board. That's what happened with the ozone regime. Industry really was at the forefront. And as a result, we were able to get a really good international mechanism in place, to which every state in the international community has signed on to. So we need similar action in relation to climate change, but it's a much more complex issue, as I said. So I wish the law would be more powerful, but it's really hard.
So I want to say thank you for that uplifting discussion about the future of the world. It sounds like we're in a wonderful spot right now moving forward. One thing, actually I have two things. engaged in. And I know that there has been some discussion about the impact that that has had on the environment.
Yeah.
Would you care to discuss? And I'm sure you've looked at that as well.
Mhm.
To be clear.
Yeah, unfortunately, at the beginning, with the lockdowns, yes, there was a marked improvement in air quality, particularly in places like New Delhi. But even with the pandemic, the overall emissions have gone up. It's very unfortunate because people thought that, with all these lockdowns, the emissions would go down. Initially it did, but not afterwards.
So the follow-up is if we're choosing the behavior is extraordinarily difficult. There's really two methods. One is fear, and the other one is and because climate change falls into the fear category,
Mhm.
but it's kind of like watching a train wreck in slow motion.
Yep.
Are we at the point that we might be trying to save that train that's going to crash?
Yes.
And should we be looking more at an engineering solution to this as opposed to a reduction in behavior from a human point of view? Thank you.
Yeah, so I like to show this slide when it comes to climate change, how people respond. And yeah, paralysis. Some people are too overwhelmed with this. Some just shrug and say, oh, things will be fine, right? But to your point about engineering solutions, that's something scientists are also looking at, geoengineering options, because we have not done enough to reduce our emissions. But some of the options they are looking at are also quite drastic, I would say. And we don't know the impacts of those options are going to be. Some things like, carbon capture and storage, we'll probably have to do. And I saw recently in Norway, I believe, they have developed this huge machine to suck carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we'll have to do things like that. Those are, I would say, pretty low risk. But there are other things that scientists are looking at, like injecting aerosols and putting mirrors in the outer space and all sorts of things. We don't know the impacts of any of those. But I agree. I mean, all options should be on the table because we have to solve this. And of course, the good news, of course, is that renewable sources of energy are getting much cheaper. We have become good at developing renewable sources of energy, and they're getting cheaper. So, but we have to take more action with public transportation, particularly in this country. We drive too much. But how do we get about if we don't have public transportation? Right. So we know what we have to do. Unfortunately, we are not doing it. I think there was another question.
Unfortunately for engineered solutions, they have to be in perpetuity and you have unintended consequences that people will just become outrageous.
Well, the problem with the engineering solutions is that currently it's all unregulated. Individual scientists are, experimenting with these ideas, so they are not even safe. So we don't know the long-term consequences. And some scientists are saying, who are engaged in geoengineering options, are saying, if we put this out, then states will have less incentive to reduce emissions. But I don't know, I mean, we might be at a point where we have to look at all these options. But, you know, not make a bigger mess of what we are in today. So, I don't know, I wish I had the answer.
I thought it was remarkable that Tesla achieved the $1 trillion stock level also yesterday or today. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, oh man, I sold all my Tesla stuff. How do you look at that example, something, the rapid rise of at least one electric car company, climate change implications for that? Things are happening on the other hand. My neighbor has signed up to buy one of their fancy pickup trucks, and they're still waiting like more than a year later.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are lots of things, right? I mean, there's a generational issue here as well. And technology, yeah, I mean, technology is a necessity, but it's not the only solution. There has to be lots of different action at different levels in relation to different sectors of the economy. Even what we eat is having an impact, right? We have to go for a less beef intensive, less meat intensive diet. Can the government mandate that? No, I mean, there will be a revolution, right? And, but we need to educate people, but I don't know. I mean, to what extent we can do that? I mean, certainly the younger generation is much more attuned to these issues because they know that they are going to be at the receiving end. They will be inheriting this mess from us. I don't know, education from a young age, yes, but for the current generation, I don't know. I mean, there are people who say I'll be dead and gone by the time all these things happen, so I'm fine, right?
Yeah.
But those of us who have children and grandchildren really feel about this.
Other question? Are there any other questions here? I'm not seeing any. Oh, here we go. What about the lawsuit where young people were suing to forced action on climate change? I can't believe how old people have been willing to destroy the future of their children and grandchildren. And I think you're correct. They will resent us or hate us. Maybe both.
There are lots of lawsuits. A group of children brought action last year, I believe. It's still pending. That their right to life and healthy environment is being affected. It's in the Committee of the Rights of the Child. So it's not technically a lawsuit. I mean, I don't know whether that's the one he's talking about, but it's a petition before the Committee of the Rights of the Child. So lawyers are bringing action because you know, states are not doing much. But there was a successful case in the Netherlands, and the government said you have to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't matter whether your contribution is little compared to other countries. You made a pledge under the Paris Agreement, and you have to keep to it. So there are cases that are happening. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, as I said, this is a generational problem. And, many people do feel very passionate about the impact this is having on their children and grandchildren. But at the same time, there are people who don't really care.
One last question. Yeah, thank you. One thing that strikes me is I have no idea what my carbon footprint is. I can only estimate.
Mhm.
I'm sure most of the people listening or in this room have no idea what their carbon footprint is either.
Mhm.
And that is just ignorance on our part, but it's ignorance that we don't know. And my question to you is, how can we address that ignorance? Because quite frankly, that we're all part of this problem.
Mhm.
And by the fact that we can't make educated decisions about what our own individual impact is striking to me. Because if I knew, I could make more educated decisions about my impact to the environment, but I don't know. So I'd like you to comment on how you could see that being a methodology to moving forward. Thank you.
So you can learn about your carbon footprint, right? I'm sure there's an app for it. There's an app for everything, right, these days. So something that people ask is, what can we do as an individual, right? Whether that will have an impact. Definitely. I mean, we are over, what, 6 billion people. So what we do have an impact. So educating ourselves as to what we can do, how to reduce our footprint, right? I don't know how many of you drove here today or took the bus. I usually take the bus, but today, because of this lecture, I drove, right? And I try not to drive. And we are lucky that we have a good public transportation system here, but even when we have that choice, a lot of us decide to drive. We can cycle. So there are lots of things that we can do. And what did we eat today? Right? So we can calculate our carbon footprint. We can educate ourselves. We can do certain things at home to reduce our carbon footprint. But at the same time, it's not just, there was a headline recently, maybe a couple of years ago. It said billionaires are the cause of climate change. No matter what we do as individuals, it's not going to make a change until we make drastic changes at that level. And it goes to the question you asked about, billionaires. So, yeah, there are things that we can do, but we also need some drastic action, some bold action at the federal level, at the global level too.
And Chris, person online pointed out there's a calculator online. If you go to carbonfootprint.com.
I appreciate that. The problem is that at the purchase point, when I'm purchasing something, I don't know the carbon footprint of something that I purchased.
So that's where carbon taxes come, right?
Potentially, but at the same point, that would be a hidden tax at that. Like, why wouldn't we just want to put on goods the amount of carbon something utilized to produce it? Like, why would we do that for calories, right?
Right. So that was something that has given, like with the GMO debate, equal labeling. There's a big debate going on whether it's compatible with trade law, with the WTO law. I'm not going to go there, I'm not a WTO expert, but that's something that has been discussed. But I agree. I mean, this is something that we can do quite easily, I think, so that, it becomes habit. We look at the label, to look at the calories and all that. if we can put something like that, eco-labeling, I think is important. Carbon capture is important. We should say part of the problem here is that we don't internalize this part. We don't put a value to water, right? To the output, like the disposal of e-waste is a huge problem, right? We don't think about those things. It goes back to the consumption and the economic system we have. Unless we do something about the economic system, which has given rise to the problem, we are not going to achieve much, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate the question.
See you next week.